Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, brought to you by Lace Partners. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard, joining you once again on this Thursday that we always release our fabulous podcast, if we do say so ourselves. And it's another one which has got another fabulous external guest that we are bringing in with us. But before I do that, as you will know if you are a regular listener of our podcasts, I do enjoy having a partner in crime and a co-host. And she's back once again. It's Emma Leonis-Hughes. How are you doing, Ems? You all right?
I'm really good, thank you, Chris. Yeah.
So today's an interesting one because we're going to talk about a report. What I normally do is introduce our guest before we go into our fundamentally different icebreaker question. Actually, I will introduce it. It's Jennifer Liston-Smith, who is the Head of Thought Leadership at Bright Horizons. Jennifer, how are you doing?
Hi, Chris. I'm doing well. Thank you. Lovely to be here with you.
It's lovely to have you on the show. So the reason why I was hesitating there is because we've done a little bit of green room pre-prep, and our fundamentally different question today, and you'll get the segue, listener, when you hear it, is that the Loch Ness Monster. So I read an article that said NASA has been asked to help the Loch Ness Centre in Inverness to help them find the Loch Ness Monster, or to reopen the search. And that got me thinking, what would I really like NASA to help me find? And I'm going to ask that question to our guest and our co-host, Emma, in a second. But my choice would be a car parking space in Uxbridge, where I live, because there is never a car parking space. So if NASA can help me find that, then they are doing a service to me, my household, and my wife as well. But Ems, what do you want? What would you like NASA to help you find?
Well, I'm not sure it exists, or maybe it does somewhere and it's been held as a very well-kept secret, but a cloning machine. I'd love to be able to clone myself so that I could have a break and the cloned me could look after my little Hurricane Henry, who genuinely just has energy coming out of his ears. I don't know where it all comes from, and it's exhausting. So if they could find me that, I would be grateful for eternity.
Yes, and we're going to ask Jennifer her choice in a second, but there's a reason why we're mentioning the fundamentally different question first, and that's because, Ems, you came across an interesting report. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you're a new mother, and you came across an interesting report that you sent to me and said, oh, this might be a good one for the podcast. So do you just want to intro it and where you found it and that, and then we'll get Jennifer to do her fundamentally different question and talk a little bit about Bright Horizons?
Yeah, sure. I think I was probably reading a broader kind of HR magazine type article that was talking around some of the challenges that maybe working parents were facing, thinking about benefits, flexible working, that kind of broader context. And it mentioned this report by Bright Horizons. Oh, that's interesting. I'll have a read of that on my commute home one day from London. So I did. And as a parent, as you mentioned, Chris, and obviously, lots of our team have caring commitments, be that for children, be that for more, elderly members of their family, even pets. A lot of it just really resonated with me. And particularly when we think about employee experience, and I know we've been talking a lot about that at Lace over the past few months, and clearly it's something that's very important for all CPOs and HR directors to think about with their employees, and thinking around engagement and retention, etc. It just struck me as something really relevant that everyone can relate to in some shape or form, for those reasons I said. And I thought, hey, why don't we see if we can get Jennifer on to talk a little bit about it and maybe share some perspectives, some insights, some examples that hopefully might be relevant to people.
Lovely. So, Jennifer, you're not going to get away with not answering the fundamentally different question. So before you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself and Bright Horizons, what's going to be your thing that you'd love NASA to help you find?
Thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to answer that question. And I would like them to find Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, since that's what they've been asked to do. I think that would be very cool. But personally, there's a little bit of land in North Wales that my sister and I inherited when my dad died a couple of years ago. And it's really important from a conservation point of view. And we now manage that land. Dad managed it for conservation for many years. And my mum, my late mum, always had a view that we were about to find some Roman remains on that land because, there's quite a lot of archaeology around. There's certainly Iron Age hill forts. There are Roman things nearby. So I'd like NASA looking from space to be able to tell us what's there and to get a better view of that landscape and sort of reveal it.
I love that. And that's certainly one of the most compelling, I think, of the three, certainly. But yes, excellent. That's a really good answer. But of course, that's just our intro bit. Let's delve into the Modern Families Index. But before we do that, obviously, it might be worth, for those listeners who haven't heard of Bright Horizons or don't know your good self, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and then also Bright Horizons as well? And then we'll talk about the report.
So I'm a business psychologist. I was one of the movers and shakers in the whole movement that was originally called maternity coaching in the UK, now called parent transition coaching or parental leave coaching. And that was in the role in which I joined what became Bright Horizons. It was a business that Bright Horizons acquired called My Family Care. And I set up and led the coaching and consultancy side of that business for about a decade. But Bright Horizons is a wonderful business that many would recognise, perhaps the brand, as being representing excellence in early education. We have around 300 community nurseries in the UK, so many would know the brand from that. But on our client-facing side, in the UK, we serve over 420 clients, leading employers, and globally Bright Horizons serves about 1,300 clients across the US, the UK, Ireland, Australia, the Netherlands, India. So we have a big presence, and we work with leading employers basically to help work and family work together, for that combination to work for the employees, for the managers, for the organisation. How do we do that? Well, it's partly about care. It's partly about, provision of early education for employers through things like workplace nurseries, through backup care, importantly, care solutions when care arrangements fall over on a given day or there are gaps in care, but also things like coaching through work and family life transitions, digital online solutions, coaching toolkits online, access to speak to an expert services, life stage based content. So it's a whole range of things that essentially enable the employees and the organisation to keep those important work-life integration questions answered.
Yeah. Brilliant. And let's talk about the report then specifically, because I think this is quite an interesting one, as Emma mentioned, from a engagement perspective, from a fact that you have different sort of employee personas and people at different parts in their lives, learning about some of the challenges that families come across. I think this was quite a fascinating report. Can you just give our listeners maybe a 1 minute before I let Emma start to help me delve into some of the questions on the report itself, like why did you decide to do it? And also, who do you actually survey?
Bright Horizons has been running the Modern Families Index in the UK since 2012, so well over a decade now. And it's a really important data set, which our HR community relies on. And it gives a really interesting sort of year-on-year look at what the UK population is thinking and feeling as working parents. It's 3,000 randomly selected working parents, and many of them are also carers, but it's working parents that they're selected in on. So they don't have a connection with Bright Horizons. It's not the parents from our nurseries. It's not our clients' employees. They're random as a population. However, it gives us a really important contrast and comparator with one of our other annual surveys, which is of our client employees. So we can see the difference between the overall UK population and those client employees that we work with. And we know that year on year, the HR world looks to this data set to see what's current, to see what they ought to be paying attention to. And it's also really relevant, of course, to our service development, that we keep ahead of the trends and we keep innovating in the services we provide.
I think kind of what really struck me was some of the insights and examples in there, Jennifer. And I think probably over the past few years, things have been looking quite good. People felt that they could maybe discuss family-related issues quite openly at work, and they felt they had employer support, because I know that in particular had risen year on year. But actually this year, I think it was maybe one of the first times in recent sort of years it started to drop a bit, which is surprising. And given the previous trends around that, talk a little bit about burnout and how that's affecting different groups and demographics. Talk a little bit also around some of the risks part of that, and some of the differences, perhaps, which shocked me slightly, given that in my experience, and this is not me criticising my husband by any stretch of the imagination, but a baby always wants their mum. And, I find that is a big emotional draw on me. And I find that balancing work is quite interesting, managing that transition back. And I feel quite comfortable having that conversation at work but I wouldn't necessarily have expected men to. Yet the flip side of that is the case in this report. I thought was quite interesting that men might feel more comfortable discussing family-related issues with their employer than women. I mean, it's not a massive difference, but for me, in terms of it was 71%, I think, of men and 68% of women said that. But that did surprise me. So there's just a few snippets there that we can delve into. But maybe we start with one of the headlines, which I think was in the risk section, that you start with in the report, which is, I think it's nearly 42%. And in another report, I've seen 50% of people are actually looking to leave their job in the next 12 months or actively considering something different, which is a lot of people.
Thanks, Emma. That's right. And you talk about the risk section of the report. We've structured it by the 3 R's that we've selected: the risks that we've seen, the reality for working parents and carers, and the retention tools that flow from that. And as you say, under the risks, the flight risk, the risk of people looking around for new work in the next year, has risen since last year. It was 38% last year, 42% this year. And all of that rise, coming back to the other point, or one of the other points you were making, all of that rise is accounted for by women saying they are more likely to leave. So that's a really important flag for employers at a time when some businesses have been trimming down their headcount post-COVID and very much need to retain the people that they have. And working parents are looking around. And when we asked what they were looking for in new work, the biggest driver was high pay. But the second biggest was better support for family life amongst about a third of people. And that comes ahead of things like I want to change, or career progression, or even just better benefits overall. So there's a real hunger there for recognition of family life. And as you say, for the first year since we've been running the survey, that's begun to either plateau or indeed fall in terms of how people are perceiving the supportiveness of their employer.
I think that, is a bit of a call to action as well, isn't it? I'm not saying that HR directors and organisations haven't been thinking about this, but given we are now seeing a drop, it's hang on, we need to really consciously focus on some of these things. And in that kind of piece around the risks, I think I read that carers are most likely to seek other employment, sort of one of those demographic groups being carers. And I wonder why that is. Is it that actually a lot of focus has been on things such as parental leave policies in recent years and childcare support, but actually carers haven't yet received that type of focus and they're next on the list from an organisation standpoint? I wonder what you think to that, Jennifer.
There are demographic shifts, aren't there? I know from the Centre for Ageing Better, there are over 10 million people currently in the UK aged over 65. It makes up 18% of the population. The number of people aged over 50 in the last 40 years has increased by 40%. So all the numbers are going in the direction of an ageing population. So we ought, as employers, to be paying attention to all generations in the workforce. It's really important that we engage with Gen Z and we keep on paying attention to what younger people expect about that sort of whole psychological contract at work. And we need to keep hold of our older workers because they are ones that are falling out of the workforce en masse. So I think a lot of employers are, in my experience, really waking up to that now. I mean, bear in mind, this is the generic UK population. The clients we work with are paying a lot of attention to carers, and our backup care solution, for example, includes adult and elder care. So there's a lot of that in place, which is a very practical help. We have our Speak to an Expert service, which provides advice on navigating the care maze, because that can be excruciating, actually, not only time consuming, but really heart-rending, trying to find care solutions for elders and all of the careful emotional navigation that goes with that of, people that used to care for us now needing care themselves. It's a very delicate issue, and, our employees encounter that, and they can encounter that at any life stage, but the likelihood increases of having those elder parents depending as our age increases. And if we don't pay attention to that as employers, then people do fall out of the workplace because they can't see a way of sustaining both. And their wish to care in a dignified way pulls them away from work. But if we can accommodate them as employers, then we get to keep their talents. Plus, carers often say that work is what keeps me sane, or it gives me that sort of sense of identity. So it's really important socially as well.
Yeah, and I think the idea of that workplace flexibility is quite critical, isn't it? So we talk about younger parents and, the need for childcare. And obviously there's mentions in the report about, 2/3 of parents concerned about availability of places. What we also then talked about, as the aging population grows and you've got more carers, there are challenges there. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the importance of businesses recognising the flexibility that needs to be delivered through workplace flexibility. Because if you think about it, if I've got a challenge, I know, Emma, obviously you've once or twice, and we've talked about if your boy's not well, we've had to rearrange. And even this podcast, we've had to rearrange because there was slight illness, which is totally cool. And we've been able to then deliver that flexibility. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of, whether you are seeing or whether you think businesses are recognising the need for flexibility on task almost at the last minute. Do businesses need to have a bit of a rethink at how they cover the work and the skills? Because in some instances, like the example that we've just given, it was very, very easy. Like the three of us could say, cool, we'll just rearrange the podcast recording. But there are some instances where it can't happen. So do organisations need to have a rethink? I guess that's my question. And how do they put in place those better structures to deal with challenges?
Yes, I mean, they absolutely need to have a rethink, not least because the new legislation has just come in early this month for the day one right to request flexible working. So employers that weren't already there, and the clients that we work with largely were, but for those who weren't, that's a necessity now to make sure that they're consulting with employees on those requests and looking at how to make flexible working the default. And what I've also noticed is that sometimes the flexible working debate gets tied together with hybrid working and remote working. And we need to look at flexibility across the board. We need to look at flexibility in terms of time. We need to look at things like job shares that enable part-time working in really senior roles, or simply part-time working in senior roles, and get our heads around how that can be chunked down. So there's all sorts of ways in which we need to keep thinking about it. But back to the data, when we asked whether parents felt able to progress, parents and carers to progress their careers while working flexibly, 67% said yes overall. That was down 1 percentage point from last year. And interestingly, 71% of men felt able to progress while working flexibly versus only 63% of women. So that's really counterintuitive. People have always thought it was easier for women to request flexibility, but actually maybe it's easier to get it, but not then to be taken seriously as a prospect for advancement within the organisation. The other thing I would add is, yes, we need flexibility, and things like doing the school run have become more commonplace for people to talk about if we're working in a hybrid way, for, the kids to kind of come in and integrate at the end of the school day where they're old enough to be doing their homework in the background and things like that. So it's important we keep having those conversations. But the other thing is that with something like backup care, where you've got younger children, you need care. You cannot have, like we did in the pandemic, the kind of crazy backdrop of children running back and forth. So where there is a breakdown in care, where a child is ill or whatever, the ability to have a nanny come to the home, or the ability where, the childminder's away or on holiday, to have some other care swing into place is really vital for that continuity, so the workload doesn't get transferred to another person in the team, or left. So I think, yes, flexibility, and yes, practical solutions to fill in those gaps as well, so that we don't just endlessly feel that we have to flex around everything that comes up. There are other things we can do to help make that work.
Yep. And we're just moving on to the sort of the second section, the reality section that you talk about in the report. And I thought there was some interesting numbers in there, particularly. So I don't have kids. I don't have kids like Emma, but I do have a pet. So quite interesting discussions around pet care. And do you think people underestimate this? Because as you were just saying, we were just talking about the need to be flexible because things happen at the last minute, and businesses that have that ability to adapt, not only does it help from an engagement perspective because, oh, look, my organization is willing to flex to my needs. And so therefore, I'm going to naturally become more engaged with that. But that ability to be kind of more open inside of it. But can we just talk about, just because it's more pertinent to me, let's talk about the pet care stuff. Do you think people underestimate the importance to recognise that, they're family members too, right? What are the things that HR teams or businesses in general can be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's really important, Chris. They are family, and it also means that we take a more diverse and inclusive approach when we talk about family. When we recognize not everybody has children, some people simply don't. They may choose not to, or it doesn't happen. And many people do have family in different ways, including those furry, four-legged friends or scaly friends or whatever they are that form part of our families. And actually, I looked up the website Statista, and they said that in 2023, they estimated there were 12 million dogs and 11 million cats living in UK homes. And the PDSA says 53% of UK adults own a pet. So, this is an important area to grasp for HR people. One of the things that we do know as well is that many people acquired pets during lockdown, and the return to office has necessitated leaving those pets. And therefore, there's a need for care. And actually, talking of backup care, as I was earlier, backup care is innovated to include pet care now. So not only does it include virtual tutoring for older children, so it's accounted for more inclusion of different family life stages, but it now includes pet care. So those people who are saying, well, in order to fulfill my work commitments, I need to get into a central workplace and Rover needs looking after, they can use their backup care allowance to get help with that and to get dog walkers, dog sitters, cat sitters, and so on.
I will let Emma ask a question, but Iago, my cat, was very delighted when we got a cat flap, because before then he wasn't allowed to leave the house. But sorry, segue. That's a segue. Emma, bring us back on track before I talk about my pet all day.
It's all good. It's all good. And I guess sort of something else in terms of that reality piece, linking from what we've talked about around carers, be that for, your parents, or be it for your children, or be it for pets, is also, I guess, the impact that all of that has. So you're balancing that, the day-to-day demands of your family, whatever family means to you, balancing the day-to-day expectations of going to work, because all of us have to work, whatever shape or form that takes. And that's a difficult balance. Also, then there's lots of other things going on more broadly. We've talked about the cost of living and that type of thing in the broader economic environment. So burnout comes out as one of the reality points in your report as well. I picked out one or two things. So 31% of people with a child aged 0 to 2 said that they felt they were at risk of burning out. 28% are concerned about their partner's mental health. That in itself is just two interesting stats. I guess, is there anything that sort of surprised you, or are there any interesting innovations that maybe you've seen in your client base to actually support some of that and reduce the burnout piece?
One thing that went together with it in the report for me as well was gendered carrying of the mental load of family. So we had 48% of men in the survey, or everyone in the survey identified as either male or female, no other genders represented or declared. 48% of men said that they carry the mental load for family life. 74% of women said that they carry the mental load for family life. So despite, what is an increasing equality in many families, there is still a gendered aspect to that, and women carrying the mental load and therefore showing higher signs of burnout and stress. And I think it's your question, what are employers doing? I mean, I think one of the things, Bright Horizons is a signatory to the Mindful Business Charter, which I think is a great initiative. And one of the aspects of that is to understand that we can't only address well-being on an individual level. Yes, it's great, if we provide classes in mindfulness and things like that, fantastic. It does have a great individual benefit. And at the same time, we need to be looking at how we structure work. How are we running meetings? How are we delegating? How are we having better conversations between the businesses and their clients or suppliers, and more honest conversations about integrating work and life. So I think those kind of things are definitely happening, and they're really important. And coming back to our world of helping organizations to manage that balance of work and family, or that integration of work and family, we have a lot of people make use of our Speak to an Expert service to try and figure out the things that are sapping their energy, because people may be feeling burnt out at work because they've got a teenager that stopped communicating, or because mum's had a dementia diagnosis and, what next? It's a terrifying world. Or baby won't sleep, toddler won't sleep, toddler's having tantrums. And all of that is very normal. All of these things are part of life. But if people are sitting on their own with these things, it can be very lonely. It feels like I'm the only person who's ever faced this, or somehow is not adequate to the challenge of it. And if I can get advice from somebody who's seen it all, and I can try a few things and find that they can make a difference, then that makes a huge impact in a positive way. So I think it's all sorts of things. I think it's, yes, there's real evidence of burnout, and we need to act at an organizational level as to how we reduce the causes of stress, and we need to act at a personal level, whether it's well-being initiatives and or these practical measures to help make the issues better as well.
Some really good suggestions there. And I guess the challenge now is that the boundaries between work and life are just so blurred, and they've been blurring more and more and more, particularly with COVID, because it all just mashed into one for a lot of people. And I don't necessarily want to be too provocative, but there might be some people listening to this podcast who are going, but it's not just all on the employer to solve. And that's fair. So I suppose it's, if you're an HR director, a CPO, you're there thinking about your EVP, you're considering what the basics are versus what you want to dial up as your competitive edge. And I know in another sister report, if I may call it that, you give some examples of those. It's more around parental leave, but different, I guess, degrees of benchmarking, I suppose, for initiatives that are offered. If you're considering basics to competitive edge, where do you really start? And kind of where do you draw that line as to what you can afford to do and what's in your control versus things that you just can't, because it's such a big issue to solve. So yeah, I'm not being provocative in the sense of I don't think employers should do nothing. They should, but it's a difficult one, I think, to get the right balance of, potentially.
The question for me is not so much is the issue the responsibility of the employer, it's is it having a business impact? Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the reasons people put backup care in place is to have people physically present to work, because they've had a nanny rock up in their home, they're available, go out to work, or indeed work from home with that nanny there, for example, really clear case. But the other aspect is, are people mentally present at work? So they may be physically present, but distracted. And so if I'm an employer and my people are balancing all of these needs, it is my problem, even if I haven't caused it. It's how my talented people are able to bring their best to work. And increasingly, if we look at the generational expectations, again and again, there is an expectation that work would be part of life rather than life be completely set aside for work. So if we want to employ people of all generations, if we want to employ people of all genders, if we want people in senior roles who have hands-on experience of family life, and by the way, they tend to bring more empathy, men and women, when they have family life, it puts things in perspective, whatever that family means. Even Iago, the cat, gives you that more empathy and perspective, I'm sure, Chris. So when people, have that engagement in their own lives and their own families, and they bring that to work, they are going to be better leaders as a result. So if we were only able to promote to leadership those people who aren't involved in family life and not engaged in it, then we would have a very depleted workforce. So, I think it's not so much do we see it as our responsibility, but what do we want to be able to achieve as businesses, and how do we remove the barriers for people?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Jennifer. And I know at the end of the Modern Families Index report, you talk about how you demonstrate value and the impact of some of the initiatives. I know it's just a starting point, but I think it's a really good starting point. And you alluded to some there. You said around how do we reduce absence? And if we've got people engaged at work, they might, be more productive. There's lots of different ways you can measure the impact of initiatives. But I think that's important too, because it all helps with building that case for why all of this is so important. And actually, sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference, which is another way to look at it, particularly for organisations who might be smaller, might not have as much investment that they can put in some of these things financially. But again, making sure that you understand the impact is I think, important. So the end of the report has a couple of examples on those, which I really liked as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think you hinted earlier at the increasing use of childcare. We've had this increase in England, this increase in funded childcare places, and many people are quite excited about that, want to return to work or increase their working hours. And there is concern about the availability of places, because there may be more demand than can be met. And there's a real role there for employers around facilitating access to childcare. Also, employers who have a workplace nursery or a workplace nursery partnership with a community nursery, they can operate a scheme that brings tax exemptions. So it's a cost of living benefit as well, which is still so important to so many people. So the employer can facilitate the access to high quality early years education, and they can enable their people through saving on tax and NI, and the employer saves their own NI as well. They can enable that continuity of work. We know from our research with our client employees, people attribute greater productivity, greater loyalty, greater well-being to the presence of a workplace nursery, just as they do to backup care. So these are places where employers can step in. It's helping with cost of living. It's helping with their own goals as an employer. And as you say, Emma, sometimes it's the little things, but it's also sometimes the big things as well. Childcare is a really big thing. It's a big expense for people, and it's a big part of family values, really. You know, who's educating and looking after my children? It matters. And if the employer is playing a role in that, then my loyalty to that employer and my association, positive association with that employer brand, is going to be huge.
Yeah, absolutely huge. And obviously you talk about that in the report under the retention tools section, where you talk about don't lose the family friendly brand. And it's something that is very, it's easy. Well, it's not easy to overlook, but I suspect for some businesses, they don't consider that, the value that adds to your employer brand, to your overall proposition. If you can then have people that you can, such engagement from them, you know, and you talked earlier about being mentally prepared for work, and that has an impact to it. You know, if my organization, I see my organization as family friendly, if they can provide the tools that enable me to be mentally prepared for work, the productivity increases. And we talk about in our campaign that we did called the Employee Experience Revolution, we talk about a holistic mindset to employee experience. You know, it's not just about here we're going to give you some technology and some tools. It's actually thinking all of these different facets of somebody's working life. You know, the physical desk space that I have right here sat at home, the physical desk space in the office, you know, the environment, the impact of my leader, like the ability that I have to be mentally prepared for work. What's the employer brand of my organization? All of these things contribute together. We are out of time, unfortunately, which is really annoying, actually, because there's loads of stuff that we can get through, but there are lots and lots of interesting stats, information, advice, guidance that are in the report. We will put a link in the show notes to the report. Just wanted to wrap up today by saying thank you very much, Jennifer, for giving us a little bit of time today to talk through it. So it's been really, really good to have you on.
Thank you, Chris. Very happy to come back and talk again as well.
Yes, we could probably do a round two, couldn't we?
Yes, but really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you. And I really hope it's been helpful to our listeners as well.
Yeah, really, really good too. And Ems, as always, thank you very much for co-hosting me.
Thank you for having me on, Chris.
Yep, always good, always good. Of course, you can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can also access all of our thought leadership, our content that we put on the Lace Partners website. It's lacepartners.co.uk/insights. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed recording it today. And hopefully we'll see you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.